It was a crisp, sunny morning, the kind that made the bustling city seem almost peaceful. The streets buzzed with life, as coffee shops filled with chatter and cars weaved through the crowded roads. Amid the chaos, Officer Don Reed adjusted his badge and holstered his radio, his eyes scanning the surroundings with the practiced vigilance of a man who had spent years on the force. To him, this wasn't just another day. It was an opportunity to maintain order, or at least his version of it. Don prided himself on being sharp, always ready to act. But beneath his calm exterior lay a simmering arrogance, a belief that he knew best, no matter the situation. His decisions, often tinged with prejudice, had gone unchecked for far too long. Today, however, would test everything he thought he knew. Across town, Judge Maya Henderson walked confidently into a small cafe, her commanding presence turning heads. Dressed in a sleek, understated suit, she exuded authority without trying. Maya wasn't just a federal judge, she was a symbol of justice, fairness, and perseverance. As a black woman, she had faced her share of struggles and discrimination on her way to the bench. But she had never let those experiences dim her resolve. She believed in the law and in the power of truth, even when the world around her seemed stacked against it. Maya ordered her coffee and stepped back outside, a briefcase in hand, ready to tackle a long day in court. Her schedule was packed, but that was nothing new. She thrived under pressure. But as she walked toward her car, the sound of raised voices and the screech of tires cut through the air. Her sharp instincts told her something was wrong. Down the block, Don had stopped a woman for what he claimed was a minor traffic violation. The situation escalated quickly. His tone was curt, his words laced with assumptions he didn't even bother to hide. The woman, a young mother trying to explain she was late to pick up her child, stood frozen, fear etched across her face. Don, however, was in no mood to listen. Maya's path intersected with this scene just as Don was raising his voice further. She hesitated for a moment, debating whether to intervene. Her position as a federal judge meant she had to be cautious, but her instincts as a human being wouldn't let her walk away. "Is there a problem here, officer?" Maya's voice cut through the tension like a knife, calm yet commanding. Don turned, surprised and visibly irritated by her interruption. His eyes flicked over her, and something about the way he looked at her sent a chill down Maya's spine. It wasn't just the authority in his stance. It was the unmistakable hint of disdain in his gaze. "This doesn't concern you, man," Don replied curtly, clearly not recognizing her. He gestured dismissively, as if shooing her away. Maya stood firm. "I think it does." I couldn't help but notice the distress on this young woman's face. "Are you sure this is being handled appropriately?" Don's jaw tightened. To him, she was just another meddler, someone who didn't understand the pressures of his job. "I suggest you move along before you find yourself in trouble," he said, his tone sharp. Trouble? Maya almost laughed at the irony, but she kept her composure. "I think you'll want to reconsider that statement," she replied, her voice steady. But Don wasn't listening. He was already reaching for his handcuffs, his irritation bubbling into action. And then it happened. Don made a decision he would regret for the rest of his life. Without another word, he grabbed Maya's arm, snapping the cuffs around her wrists with unnecessary force. The cafe crowd gasped, and the young mother took a step back, her eyes wide with shock. Maya didn't resist. She didn't need to. Her expression was one of calm defiance, her silence speaking louder than any protest. Don's partner, who had been standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably. "Don, you might want to." "Not now," Don barked, cutting him off. He was too focused on asserting his authority to notice the murmurs spreading through the crowd. Someone had recognized Maya. Phones were coming out, cameras pointed squarely at the scene. But Don didn't notice, or didn't care. Maya, now seated in the back of Don's patrol car, looked at him through the rearview mirror. "Officer," she said quietly, "do you have any idea who I am?" Don snorted. "Does it matter?" A small, knowing smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Oh, it matters more than you think." And with those words, the balance of power shifted. Don didn't realize it yet, But his world was about to be turned upside down. The car ride was silent at first, save for the faint hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of Dan's police radio. Maya sat composed in the back seat, her hands still cuffed, a gaze fixed on the city streets as they rolled by. Her mind wasn't on herself. It was on the young mother left behind. Maya hoped the woman had managed to leave safely, that her child wouldn't be left waiting much longer. But she also knew she couldn't let this incident go unchecked. Dan gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, his jaw clenched. Something about this woman unsettled him, though he couldn't put his finger on it. She wasn't panicked or pleading, which was what he'd come to expect. Instead, she carried herself with an air of quiet authority that felt almost accusatory, as though she knew something he didn't. It gnawed at him, but he wasn't about to let her see that. Behind them, Dan's partner, Officer Chris Martinez, followed in another patrol car, his mind racing. Chris had been on the force long enough to know when a situation was spiraling out of control. This was one of those times. He had recognized the woman the moment she'd stepped into the confrontation. How could Dan not? Chris wanted to intervene, to say something, but Dan's temper wasn't easy to navigate, especially when his authority felt challenged. Now, with cameras undoubtedly capturing every angle of the arrest, Chris knew this was going to blow up. He just didn't know how badly. At the precinct, Maya was led inside, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. The officers at the front desk looked up, their expressions shifting from routine indifference to stunned recognition. A murmur rippled through the room as they watched Dan escort her toward the holding area. "Wait, Dan, is that who I think it is?" One officer whispered to another, but Dan didn't hear it. He was too focused on maintaining control of the situation, even as it slipped further from his grasp. Maya's calm demeanor remained intact, but her eyes darted around, taking in every detail. The precinct was familiar territory, though not usually from this perspective. She noted the officers' reactions, the subtle shift in their body language as they whispered among themselves. It was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots and said something. She decided to wait, to let this play out a little longer. Maya was patient. She knew the power of timing. Dan led her to a small room, stark and cold, with a single table and 2 chairs. He gestured for her to sit and uncuffed her wrists, his movements quick and impersonal. Maya rubbed her wrists lightly but said nothing. She took her seat and crossed her legs, watching as Dan pulled out a notepad and clicked his pen. "Let's start with your name," he said, his tone curt. Maya raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Judge Maya Henderson," she replied evenly, her voice carrying just enough weight to make Dan pause. He froze, his pen hovering over the page. For a moment, the words didn't register, and when they did, his grip on the pen faltered. He looked up at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and confusion. "Judge," he repeated, as though the word itself was foreign. "That's correct," Maya said, her tone unwavering. "United States District Court. I was on my way to a hearing when you decided to arrest me for... what exactly?" Dan's face reddened. He glanced at the door as though hoping someone might come in and save him from the sudden weight of his mistake, but no one did. That doesn't change anything," he stammered, though his voice lacked its previous conviction. "You interfered with an investigation." "I asked a question." Maya corrected him, leaning forward slightly. "A question that any concerned citizen has the right to ask. But instead of answering, you escalated the situation. And now here we are." Dan's mind raced. He felt the walls closing in, the certainty he carried earlier dissolving into doubt. How had he not recognized her? And what was he supposed to do now? Chris appeared at the door, knocking lightly before stepping inside. "Dan, can I have a word?" he asked, his tone pointed. Dan nodded stiffly and followed Chris into the hallway, leaving Maya alone in the room. As soon as the door closed, Chris turned to him, his expression a mix of urgency and frustration. "Dan, do you have any idea who she is?" Chris asked in a hushed tone. "She said she's a judge," Dan muttered, avoiding Chris's gaze. "She asterisk is asterisk a judge," Chris emphasized. a federal judge. "Do you know what kind of trouble we're in right now? This isn't some random person off the street. She's got connections, influence. And on top of that, there are cameras out there, Dan." People saw what happened. Dan's stomach sank. He opened his mouth to argue, to defend his actions, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he ran a hand through his hair, his mind spinning. Chris shook his head. "Look, I don't know how you're going to fix this, but you need to figure it out. Fast. Because if this gets out, and it will, we're all going to feel the heat." Inside the interrogation room, Maya sat patiently, her hands folded on the table. She could feel the tension mounting on the other side of the door, but she wasn't in a hurry to end it. Every second they spent fumbling for a solution was another second they had to confront their actions. Dan eventually re-entered the room, his expression guarded but less sure of himself. He sat down across from Maya, the notepad abandoned on the table. For the first time since their encounter, he hesitated, as though weighing his next words carefully. "Judge Henderson," he began, his tone noticeably softer. "Perhaps we got off on the wrong foot." Maya tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "You think so?" she replied, her voice laced with quiet irony. Dan cleared his throat, trying to maintain some semblance of authority. "I'm willing to reevaluate the situation, if there's been a misunderstanding." "There was no misunderstanding, Officer Reed," Maya interrupted. "There was a choice to misuse your authority, to dismiss my presence without consideration, and to act on assumptions rather than facts. The question is, what are you going to do about it now?" Dan was silent, her words hitting harder than he cared to admit. Outside, Chris paced nervously, his phone buzzing with notifications as word of the incident began to spread. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air, unresolved and growing by the second. Dan sat across from Maya, his thoughts a storm of confusion and panic. The authority he'd been so sure of hours earlier now felt like a fragile thread slipping through his fingers. Maya, on the other hand, was unshaken. She had no intention of letting this moment pass without accountability, but she also knew that pushing too hard too soon could backfire. Timing was everything, and Maya had learned long ago how to play the long game. Outside the room, Chris paced, checking his phone again. A few of the texts coming in were from officers who had seen the incident unfold on social media. Someone in the cafe had been quick to upload a video, and now the precinct was buzzing with whispers. The clip wasn't long, but it was damning. It showed Dan slapping cuffs on Maya while she calmly stated, "I'm a federal judge." The caption read, "Asterisk racist cop arrests black federal judge for asking a question asterisk." Chris's heart sank as he replayed the video. It was already getting traction, and he knew it was only a matter of time before higher-ups got involved. He glanced toward the interrogation room, where Dan was still with Maya. Chris wasn't sure if he felt more anger or pity for his partner. Dan had a reputation for being hot-headed, but this was on another level. Back in the room, Dan cleared his throat and tried again, his voice tinged with forced professionalism. "Judge Henderson, it's clear this situation has escalated in ways that neither of us intended." Maya raised an eyebrow. "Neither of us?" she echoed, her tone cool. "I was walking to my car. You escalated this, Officer Reed. Let's not rewrite history." Dan flinched but pressed on. "I'm willing to discuss a way forward." "We can." "You don't seem to understand the gravity of what's happened here," Maya interrupted, her voice cutting through his attempt at diplomacy. "This isn't just about me. It's about the culture of your department, the choices you make on a daily basis, and the assumptions you carry into every interaction. This isn't going away because you offer an apology." Dan's frustration bubbled to the surface, his composure cracking. "Look, I didn't recognize you, okay? If I'd known who you were, this wouldn't have." Maya's sharp laugh stopped him mid-sentence. "And there it is," she said, leaning back in her chair. "If you'd known I was a judge, you would have treated me differently. That's the problem, Officer Reed. You weren't enforcing the law, you were enforcing your biases." Her words hung heavy in the air. Dan opened his mouth to respond, but closed it again, unsure of what to say. Maya's calm dismantling of his defenses was something he wasn't prepared for. He had expected anger, maybe even fear, but instead she had turned the spotlight onto him, exposing every flaw in his approach. Outside the room, Chris finally stopped pacing and made a decision. He knocked on the door and stepped inside, giving Dan a pointed look. "Can I speak to you for a moment?" he asked, his tone leaving no room for argument. Dan hesitated, glancing at Maya, who gave him a faint smile as if to say, "Go ahead." "I'll wait." Reluctantly, he followed Chris into the hallway, where his partner wasted no time. "Dan, this is out of control," Chris said, keeping his voice low. "That video from the cafe? It's already on social media. People are talking about it, and it's not looking good for you or the department." Dan's stomach twisted. "What do you mean, social media? How bad is it?" Chris pulled up the video and held his phone out. Dan watched in silence as the scene played out. Him arresting Maya, the bystanders' gasps, and her calm declaration of her position. The caption hit him like a punch to the gut. "This is bad," Chris continued. "We're talking about a federal judge, Dan. This isn't going to blow over. We need to get ahead of this before the brass gets wind of it. And you need to figure out how to make this right." Dan stared at the video, the reality of the situation sinking in. His career, his reputation, it was all on the line. But as much as he hated to admit it, Chris was right. He needed to fix this, and fast. Meanwhile, in the interrogation room, Maya sat quietly, her mind working through the layers of the situation. She wasn't surprised to hear about the video. The age of smartphones had ensured that moments like these rarely went unseen. But what intrigued her more was how the officers would handle it. She wasn't looking for vengeance. She was looking for accountability. As the minutes ticked by, the door opened again, and this time it wasn't just Dan and Chris who entered. A senior officer, Captain Elaine Carter, walked in, her expression unreadable. Elaine was a seasoned professional, someone who had weathered her share of scandals and controversies. She'd already seen the video, and she knew this was a situation that required careful handling. "Judge Henderson," Elaine began, her tone measured, "and Captain Carter. I'd like to personally apologize for what you've experienced today. This isn't how we conduct ourselves, and I can assure you this matter will be addressed." Maya studied Elaine for a moment before responding. "Thank you, Captain. I appreciate your acknowledgement, but words alone won't fix this." Elaine nodded, expecting as much. "I understand. And I'd like to discuss how we can move forward." Dan shifted uncomfortably in the background, his earlier confidence now entirely gone. He'd felt like a spectator in his own disaster, unsure of how to contribute or whether he even should. Chris, meanwhile, remained silent, watching the exchange with a mix of relief and unease. "What I want," Maya said, her voice steady, "is systemic change. I'm not interested in token apologies or temporary fixes. This department needs to address its biases, its training, and its accountability measures. And that starts with transparency." Elaine nodded again, her expression thoughtful. "I hear you, Judge Henderson, and I agree. If you're willing, I'd like to involve you in discussions about how we can implement those changes." Maya's gaze softened slightly. "That's a start," she said. "But let's be clear. This isn't about me joining your efforts. This is about ensuring that what happened today doesn't happen to someone else tomorrow." As the tension in the room shifted, Dan realized he was no longer the center of the narrative. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the broader issues at play. But the weight of his own actions still bore down on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that his career might not survive the fallout. The room fell silent as everyone considered what came next, the tension far from resolved, but the stakes now unmistakably clear. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Dan felt trapped, like a spotlight was shining directly on him, revealing every crack in his armor. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint murmur of voices in the precinct outside. Maya leaned back slightly in her chair, her calm exterior betraying none of the quiet power she carried. She had seen situations like this before, people squirming under the weight of their own actions, scrambling to save face. But this time, she wasn't just observing. She was at the center of it. Captain Carter's expression remained composed, but there was a tightness around her eyes that betrayed the pressure she felt. She glanced at Dan, her gaze sharp, before turning back to Maya. "Judge Henderson, I'll be honest with you. This situation has escalated beyond what we can handle internally. The video circulating online is already drawing attention from local media, and it's only a matter of time before it reaches national outlets. We need to act decisively." Maya nodded slowly, her mind processing the captain's words. She knew the media would latch onto this story. It was too charged, too symbolic of a larger issue to ignore. But she wasn't interested in turning this into a spectacle. That kind of attention rarely led to real change. "What do you propose, Captain?" Maya asked, her tone measured. "We're launching an internal investigation," Carter replied. "Effective immediately, Officer Reed will be placed on administrative leave while we review the incident. I'm also calling for a department-wide audit of our training protocols and policies regarding community interactions." Dan's head snapped up at the mention of administrative leave. "Captain, wait a minute," he started, but Carter cut him off with a sharp look. "You've done enough, Reed," she said firmly. "This isn't the time for excuses or justifications. You need to step back and let us handle this." Dan swallowed hard, his face flushing with a mixture of anger and humiliation. He opened his mouth to argue, but quickly realized there was no point. The room wasn't his to control anymore. Chris shifted uncomfortably in the corner, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He had been quiet for most of the discussion, but now he felt compelled to speak. "Captain," he said carefully, "with all due respect, this isn't just about one incident. We've had problems like this before, and they keep getting brushed under the rug. Maybe it's time we admit that the culture in this department needs more than just an audit." Carter's gaze sharpened, but there was no anger in it. If anything, she seemed to appreciate Chris' candor. "You're not wrong," she admitted, "but fixing a culture doesn't happen overnight. It starts with accountability, and that's what we're doing here." Maya watched the exchange silently, her thoughts turning to the broader implications of what was happening. This wasn't just about Dan or even this precinct. It was a microcosm of a much larger problem, one that required systemic change on every level. But as much as she believed in the importance of the big picture, she also knew that individual actions mattered. And right now, Dan's actions were at the center of it all. Dan shifted in his seat, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I've been on this force for 10 years, he said, his voice tinged with defensiveness. "I've done my job every day, and I've made sacrifices for this community. But one mistake." "One mistake?" Maya interjected, her voice calm but cutting. "You think this was a mistake?" "No, Officer Reed, this was a choice. A series of choices, in fact. Choices rooted in biases you refuse to confront." Dan's mouth snapped shut, his face turning red. He looked down at the table, unable to meet her gaze. Maya's words weren't just directed at him. They were a mirror, forcing him to see himself in a way he'd never had to before. The door opened suddenly, and a younger officer stepped inside, looking flustered. He handed Captain Carter a tablet, his expression apologetic. "Ma'am, you need to see this," he said quietly. Carter took the tablet, her eyes scanning the screen. Her expression hardened as she read, and she muttered something under her breath. Finally, she looked up. "The video has gone viral," she announced. "It's trending nationally. We're getting calls from reporters, advocacy groups, and even a few politicians." The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy fog. Maya wasn't surprised, but even she felt a pang of apprehension at the speed with which the situation was escalating. Public attention could be a double-edged sword. While it brought pressure for change, it also invited chaos and opportunism. Dan's face paled. "Viral?" he echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. The full gravity of his actions was sinking in, and for the first time, he looked genuinely afraid. Carter set the tablet down and turned to Maya. "Judge Henderson, I want you to know that we're committed to addressing this. But I also recognize that our words mean little without action. I'd like to involve you in our efforts moving forward. Your perspective and expertise would be invaluable. Maya considered the offer carefully. She wasn't interested in becoming a token figure or a symbolic gesture, but if this was an opportunity to push for real change, she couldn't ignore it. I'm willing to help, she said finally, but only if this department is prepared to make meaningful, transparent changes. That means holding people accountable, starting at the top. Carter nodded, her expression serious. Agreed. As the room fell into an uneasy silence, the sound of raised voices filtered in from the precinct lobby. Chris stepped to the door and peered out, his brow furrowing. There's a crowd gathering outside, he reported. Looks like reporters and a few community members. Maya glanced at the window, her reflection staring back at her. She knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The real battle was just beginning, and every choice made from here on out would determine the outcome. As the tension in the interrogation room simmered, the sound of voices from the lobby grew louder, a steady hum of anger and frustration rising with each passing moment. Maya's gaze flicked to the door, her expression thoughtful. She could feel the weight of what was unfolding beyond the walls, a community that had seen too many injustices, now galvanized by the undeniable proof of one more. Chris stepped further into the hallway, his hand resting on his belt, as if preparing for something bigger than a routine day at work. Captain, he called back into the room, his tone urgent. You might want to see this. Captain Carter exchanged a glance with Maya, then rose from her seat. Stay here, she instructed Don firmly, her voice brooking no argument. Don slumped further into his chair, his shoulders heavy with the weight of everything spiraling beyond his control. Maya, however, stood and followed Carter without a word. The captain hesitated but didn't stop her. If anything, she seemed to sense that Maya's presence might help de-escalate whatever was happening. In the lobby, the scene was chaotic. Reporters with microphones and cameras crowded the entrance, while community members held signs and chanted slogans that echoed off the walls. Words like *justice, ** accountability, * and *, no more * cut through the noise, each syllable heavy with decades of frustration. The officers stationed at the front desk looked overwhelmed, their eyes darting nervously between the crowd and their radios. One voice, louder than the rest, broke through the cacophony. A middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a booming voice stepped forward, a microphone thrust in his hand. I'm Marcus Bell, with the local chapter of the Justice Alliance, he announced, his words aimed at both the crowd and the officers inside. We've seen the video. We know what happened here, and we're not leaving until there's accountability. Carter stepped forward, her expression carefully neutral but tinged with unease. Mr. Bell, she said loudly enough to be heard, I understand your concerns. We're taking this incident very seriously, and I assure you. Seriously. Marcus interrupted, his voice rising with indignation. This department has a history of sweeping incidents like this under the rug. You're only taking it seriously because the public is watching. Don't patronize us. The crowd roared in agreement, their chants growing louder. Maya watched from a few steps behind Carter, her mind racing. She had dealt with figures like Marcus before, people who harnessed the power of collective anger to demand justice. But Marcus wasn't wrong. Too often, change only came when the spotlight was too bright to ignore. Before Carter could respond, the crowd parted slightly, and a young woman stepped forward. Her face was familiar, too familiar. Maya's breath caught as she recognized her. It was the woman from the cafe, the one who had been threatened by Don earlier that day. She was holding her son, her eyes blazing with defiance and exhaustion. I'm not here for promises, the woman said, her voice trembling but strong. I'm here because your officer put his hands on me, threatened me, and made me feel like I didn't matter. I'm here because he arrested the one person who stood up for me. And I want to know, what are you going to do about that? The crowd quieted, the weight of her words settling over them like a blanket. Even Marcus seemed momentarily taken aback, stepping aside to let her take center stage. Maya felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the countless others who had been silenced, ignored, or dismissed. Carter looked visibly shaken, but she held her ground. "Ma'am, I hear you," she began, but the woman cut her off. "No, you don't," the woman snapped. "You don't hear me. You hear the noise. You hear the cameras. But you don't hear me. I'm tired of being heard only when it's convenient." Maya took a step forward, drawing the attention of both the woman and the crowd. "I hear you," she said quietly but firmly. "And I know what it feels like to be ignored until someone decides your voice is useful. That's why I'm here now. To make sure this doesn't end with empty words." The woman's gaze softened slightly as she looked at Maya, her grip on her son tightening. "You were the one who helped me," she said, her voice breaking just a little. "You didn't have to, but you did." Maya nodded. "Because it was the right thing to do, and it still is." The moment hung heavy in the air, the crowd watching intently as Maya and the woman exchanged a look of quiet understanding. But before anyone could speak again, a commotion erupted at the back of the lobby. A man in a suit pushed through the crowd, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. His presence was commanding, his expression unreadable. "Chief Randall," Carter muttered under her breath, straightening her posture. The police chief surveyed the room, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Maya, then the woman holding her child. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice cold and clipped. "Chief," Carter began, "this is a peaceful demonstration." "It doesn't look peaceful to me," Randall interrupted, his gaze hard. "Get this under control. Now." Maya stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Chief Randall, if you're here to dismiss the voices of this community, I suggest you reconsider. This isn't going away." The chief's eyes flicked to Maya, his jaw tightening. "And you are?" "Judge Maya Henderson," she replied evenly, the weight of her title silencing the room once again. For a moment, the tension seemed ready to explode. The crowd, the officers, the woman with her child. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. Maya could feel the moment teetering on the edge, the stakes higher than ever. Whatever came next would determine everything. The room fell into a tense silence as Maya's words hung in the air. Chief Randall's sharp gaze didn't waver, but something in his posture shifted. For a moment, it seemed as though he was weighing his options, calculating the cost of ignoring the presence of a federal judge in the middle of what was quickly becoming a public relations nightmare. "Judge Henderson," Randall said finally, his voice tight. "I trust you understand the delicate nature of this situation. We're working to address it." Maya stepped closer, her calm demeanor unchanged. "Delicate situations require decisive action, Chief. The community doesn't need more empty words. They need to see accountability, starting with the officers involved. That includes Officer Reed and anyone else complicit in allowing this behavior to go unchecked." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The woman holding her son tightened her grip on him, her expression flickering between hope and exhaustion. Randall hesitated, glancing toward Captain Carter, who gave a slight nod as if to reinforce Maya's point. Before Randall could respond, the younger officer who had earlier handed Carter the tablet stepped forward hesitantly. His face was pale, and his hands were clenched tightly at his sides. "Chief, there's something else," he said, his voice barely audible. Randall turned to him sharply. "What is it?" The officer swallowed hard, then glanced at Maya and the crowd before continuing. "There's another video," he said. "It was sent anonymously, and it's already spreading online. It shows Officer Reed making comments about Judge Henderson and other individuals earlier today." The crowd erupted in a mixture of gasps and outraged whispers. Maya's stomach tightened, but she kept her face neutral. Randall's expression darkened, and Dan, who had been hovering at the edge of the room, took a step back as if he could physically distance himself from what was unfolding. "What kind of comments?" Randall demanded, though the hard edge in his voice suggested he already knew the answer. The officer hesitated, then handed the tablet to Carter, who quickly pulled up the video. Her face hardened as she watched, her lips pressing into a thin line. She turned the screen toward Randall, who snatched it from her and began watching. The room fell silent again as everyone waited, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Randall's face grew redder with each passing second. He slammed the tablet down on the desk, his jaw clenched. "Read," he barked, his voice echoing through the room. "In my office. Now." Dan's face went pale. "Chief, Now." Randall barked again, cutting him off. Dan hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting between Randall and the crowd. Then, without another word, he turned and stalked toward the hallway, his footsteps echoing loudly in the tense silence. The woman holding her son stepped forward again, her voice trembling but strong. "What happens now?" she asked, her eyes locked on Randall. "What happens to him?" "To all of them." Randall turned back to the crowd, his expression hard, but his tone slightly softer. "Officer Reed will face disciplinary action, up to and including termination. The investigation will be thorough, and anyone found to be complicit in this behavior will also be held accountable." The crowd murmured again, this time with a mix of relief and lingering skepticism. Maya stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Chief Randall, it's not enough to hold individuals accountable. This department needs systemic reform. The community deserves transparency, and they deserve a seat at the table when these decisions are made." Randall's jaw tightened, but he nodded reluctantly. "Agreed," he said after a pause. "We'll work with community leaders to implement changes, starting now." As the tension in the room began to ease, Maya glanced at the young woman who had been at the center of it all. Their eyes met, and for a moment, no words were needed. The woman's expression softened, a small but genuine smile breaking through the exhaustion. Just as it seemed the situation was settling, a voice called out from the back of the room. "Wait." A man in plain clothes pushed his way through the crowd, holding a phone. His face was flushed, and his hands were trembling. "There's another video. It's from inside the precinct. It shows someone, an officer, deleting evidence from the system." The room froze. Maya's breath caught as her mind raced. She looked at Carter, whose face had gone pale. Randall's expression hardened, and he turned to the man. "Show me," he demanded. The man hesitated, then handed over the phone. The room fell silent as Randall watched the video. His face turned a shade of red Maya hadn't thought possible, and when he looked up, his eyes burned with fury. "This isn't over," Randall said, his voice low but deadly. "Not by a long shot." Maya felt a chill run through her. The resolution she thought they were approaching had splintered into something far more complex. As the crowd murmured in confusion and growing anger, Maya realized that the fight for justice was just beginning.